Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Congolese rebels hold off on a promised pullout of the key town of Walikale. The M23 insurgents blame the suspension of their exit from the latest strategic seizure on the army. Also, at least 5 die in RSF shelling of Khartoum as the paramilitary respond to the Sudanese army's seizure of key parts of the capital at the end of last week. Meanwhile, Chad and South Sudan hit back at threats from a top Sudanese general over their alleged support for the RSF. And a Tunisian musician is cultivating a new generation of students with whom to share his love of his country's musical heritage. We'll be taking a closer look with a report from our correspondents in Tunisia. But first, DR Congo's defense minister arrived in South Africa on Monday for talks on ramping up peace and security cooperation. 14 South African soldiers, most part of a SADC regional mission in DRC, were killed there as Rwanda-backed M23 soldiers began a lightning push through the east earlier this year, which has seen them seize key cities. Now, last week, it was the strategic town of Walikale, which gives them control of routes linking 4 provinces in DRC. Now, the rebels had said that they'd pull out, but now say that they won't do so until Congolese forces go first. Juliet Monti brings us more from neighbouring Rwanda.
Rebels are reportedly still in Walikale, in North Kivu, in eastern DRC. It was seized by M23 insurgents last Wednesday. The rebel group had never pushed this far west before, making the fall of Walikale a major new victory on the ground for M23. Continuing northwest, the road leads to the major city of Kisangani. But on Saturday, the armed group said it would withdraw from Walikale in order to facilitate dialogue with the Congolese government. In response, the Congolese army announced the suspension of its offensive operations in the area. Rwanda has welcomed the concessions. Kigali, which has been accused of backing the M23, insists that it wants a political solution, as do southern and eastern regional blocs, which have set up more meetings this week to push for negotiations between the combatants involved in DR Congo's crisis. But tensions persist. The M23 accuses the Congolese army of getting in the way of peace talks by failing to withdraw attack drones from Walikale. Mediation efforts have been difficult. Angola stepped down as mediator after March 18th talks were cancelled last minute. The presidents of Rwanda and DRC met for surprise talks in Qatar and called for a ceasefire last week. But the M23 says those talks have little influence on its plans.
That breakdown by Juliette Montier there for us. Now, civilians are still bearing the brunt of a brutal battle for the upper hand between Sudan's army and the RSF paramilitary. At least 5 people were reportedly killed on Sunday evening in the shelling of a mosque in Khartoum that's been blamed on the RSF. Now, they lost control of key parts of the capital to the army on Friday, a significant shift in a complex war that's lasted since April 2023, costing tens of thousands of lives. Naba Mohadim is in Sudan, in the coastal city of Port Sudan. She brings us more now. Naba, first of all, how have those days since the army took key parts of Khartoum been followed up? What does this mean for the RSF military?
Actually, Georgia, since September 2024, the Sudanese military launched a big operation called Freeing Khartoum Operation. And since then, we saw many military gains in Khartoum, also in Sinja, Dindir, Asuki, and Wad Madani in central Sudan. So it's part of a bigger operation called Freeing Khartoum and besieging the RSF in and around Khartoum. So after the Sudanese military retook control of the presidential palace, we saw many developments on Sunday and Saturday where the Sudanese army recontrolled or regained control of main governmental buildings and also the confluence of the Nile, Tuti Island, and Bank of Sudan and the downtown of Khartoum. So fierce clashes have been raging since the fighting escalated on Friday and since the Sudanese military gained control of the presidential palace. It's not only a symbolic victory, Georgia, but also regaining control of presidential palace means the Sudanese military will penetrate towards South Khartoum and Eastern Khartoum, where the last stronghold for the RSF remains there.
And for the RSF itself, is it on the back foot now, or is it still holding an advantage on other fronts in this war?
Regarding Khartoum, Georgia, RSF right now are on the back foot, as we saw large troops of RSF are leaving Khartoum and are trying to escape. So in Khartoum, the Sudanese military is controlling large parts of it, and the RSF are losing mind in Khartoum, but that doesn't mean that the fighting ends here. It means more escalation in other fronts, and especially in Darfur, where RSF are reported to be withdrawing from Khartoum to Darfur and escalating fighting in North Darfur al-Fashir, where the last stronghold for the army and the rebel groups that are fighting with the army. So in Khartoum, yes, the Sudanese military is regaining control, and the RSF are on the back foot, but we are expecting more open scenario, especially that RSF will try to control al-Fashir and will try to gain more ground for them and for their soldiers.
So the RSF we talked about, the army we've talked about, they're the main combatants in this conflict. But we also saw the army accusing Chad of supporting the RSF and facilitating the supply of weapons and mercenaries. And throughout this conflict, there has been the influence of foreign governments. What are the details of where that aspect of the conflict stands at the moment? And what does it mean for the scope of the fighting?
Actually, Georgia, Chad and Sudan have always had very strong ties since ever. But now with the fighting, since April 2023, there is strong accusations by the Sudanese government of Chad for Chad to fuel the conflict, especially that Chad is bordering Darfur, and also there is strong social ties and tribal ties between Chad and Sudan. So the accusations, the details of accusation, there is many complaints by the Sudanese government. The complaints are on the table of the United Nations Security Council of UAE being using Chad and being using Chad airports to fuel the RSF with weapons, with military supply, and also with mercenaries. So because Chad is strategically important for Sudan and for Darfur, the accusations are strong. And actually, the Sudanese military is relying on reports and aerial footage of some weapons and drones, wide-range drones being used in the fighting in Darfur, and also the wide-range drone that we saw on the Sunday incident and other attacks in the past few weeks. So the details are so many to include what that means. The tensions between the two countries and the ties will deteriorate further, and it's so sad for hundreds of thousands of people who are crossing and who are fleeing the violence from Darfur and crossing to Chad, especially that Chad is hosting one of the biggest camps for Sudanese IDPs. And as I told you, there is a very strong ties beyond this diplomacy and deteriorating ties. So that means it will impact hundreds of thousands of people who are relying on Chad and the camps there to flee the violence in Darfur.
Thank you very much. Nabat Mohideen talking us through where the latest developments in the war in Sudan, speaking to us from Port Sudan. On Monday marked the one-year anniversary of Senegalese leader Bassirou Diomaye Faye's presidency. He's the continent's youngest elected head of state, and his win represents the hopes of many Senegalese for a new era of change. Take a look.
On the outskirts of Dakar, the cost of living is on everyone's mind. A year into President Bassirou Diomaye Faye's term, market-goers here have mixed opinions.
Last year, some things we bought were more expensive, but this year, prices have gone down, like sugar. A kilo used to cost 800 CFA francs. Now it's 600.
Life is still really hard in Senegal. Prices are high. We are exhausted.
Although the government say they've spent 73 billion CFA francs subsidizing essential goods like sugar, oil and rice, people say they are still struggling with high costs for the basics. According to Senegal's Minister of Trade and Industry, there is more help to come.
The government is doing in-depth studies on rice, oil, cement, all key raw materials. What I can say is more price cuts are coming in 2025. It's a top priority for both the President and the Prime Minister.
President Diomaye Faye was elected last year on a promise of reform, but the new leader's tenure has been marked by a major financial crisis. After widespread financial mismanagement under the previous government, the International Monetary Fund have suspended a 1.8 billion CFA franc financing program, which has constrained government spending.
This high cost of living can only be really tackled in the medium to long term. The government's options are extremely limited, especially since previous administration already eliminated many taxes and customs duties.
To cut costs, authorities say they are reviewing energy subsidies that cost 500 billion CFA a year, instead to be replaced with direct cash transfers to more vulnerable households, in the hope of increasing fiscal space for public spending.
And finally, a Tunisian musician is cultivating a new generation of students with whom to show his love of his country's musical heritage and his phenomenal skills on the North African lute called an oud. Take a look.
The Lute House is in the Medina of Tunis, in the historical quarter of the capital. There, artists learned from Ziad Mehdi. The musician has been playing since he was 12 years old. He followed his dreams and opened a lute school last year.
I'm teaching them a song using the feather technique to strum, and I'm also showing them where to place their fingers.
Ziad teaches the ma'louf, a musical genre linked to the region's Arab Andalusian past. To play it, you need a lute with 4 strings instead of the more common 6 used in Oriental styles across the region.
You have a sound that's really different. That's because of the number of strings, and there are different levels than the Oriental lute.
Ziad is particularly committed to this instrument and its repertoire, as it is taught a lot less than the common Oriental lute in music conservatories. Much of the ma'louf is also not written down in sheet music, instead transmitted orally by masters. The best-known ma'louf musician in Tunisia is Ziad Rajsa, who cultivates the tradition each Thursday at the Lute House.
I'm just hoping that with new students and a lot of works, little by little we have a generation of musicians who will play this music because it's our tradition and our cultural heritage.
Slim, an architect, comes each week to attend these music nights.
This whole atmosphere, all this sound, it's an experience in fact. It's in our memory since childhood with our parents. It's our history, our upbringing, our identity.
The Lute House also teaches children to play the lute, a way to prevent this heritage from disappearing.
Well, that's it for On Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again if you can. Till then, take care.